Thank you. It was a very sobering note to end on, but let me pick up that discussion because our second panel is really focused on the security implications and the policy responses. And so I think Emily's sort of stark conclusion there is a good place for us to pick up. Let me introduce our three panelists here. To my left is Samantha Hoffman. She's a senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Canberra, is one of the authors of our report. We'll have her make some remarks just after I finish the introductions. She'll be followed by Tim Stevens. He's the director of cybersecurity research group here at King's College. As we were chatting earlier, not a China specialist, but a cybersecurity specialist with a long career before his academic career in the private sector. And so I think we can start to look at some of the business and commercial responses as well, drawing on Tim's expertise. And then our last speaker is Greg Levesque, the CEO of Strider, which is a cybersecurity, technology, national security consulting company well, I was going to say in DC, but it's actually now global. Does a lot of consulting work for US government and Fortune 500 companies on some of these very specific issues. So Samantha, let's start with you. A few remarks from you, and then we'll go down the line to Tim and then Greg, and then just as we did with panel one, we'll open up for a few questions from me, and then we'll go to the floor.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Samantha. Thank you so much to King's College for hosting us today. So my chapter in this volume focused on the expansion of Chinese digital infrastructure globally. It's not on, okay. It didn't sound like. Okay. Is that better now? Yeah. Okay, perfect. So my chapter focused on the expansion of Chinese digital infrastructure globally. And I think that the most useful starting point for addressing these questions is to actually go back to the question of what are we actually talking about when we're talking about China's use of technology, particularly the party state's use of technology to engage in governance and to also protect and expand its own power. Oftentimes, the conversation in Western media and academia, think tanks, it focuses on the most coercive uses of technology. So the uses of surveillance technology and smart city surveillance programs. And what gets overlooked in a lot of that conversation is the ways that technology also solves the kinds of problems that any government would seek to solve. So if you're looking at a smart city in China, you've got surveillance technologies that are clearly used for coercive purposes. But you also have technologies related to improving efficiencies in governance, improving things along the lines of traffic management, public health management, and so on. The sort of more positive problem solving from our perspective, like versions of uses of technology and those more coercive uses, which in my view are also problem solving if you're, say, the Ministry of Public Security, those two things aren't contradictory. And the reason that that matters is because when we tend to think about the global application or expansion of Chinese technologies, we also tend to focus on those more coercive technologies and tend to overlook the technologies that are less visibly invasive or coercive. The problem is that if you're talking about data collecting or generating technologies, the product or the end use of that particular technology isn't the only thing we should be concerned about. It's also the way that data, when aggregated, can contribute to multiple different things at once. So in a lot of debate, we focused on companies like Huawei and the risk of espionage. And that's taken place at the expense of looking at many other types of companies that are engaged in other activities, which might not be clearly linked to security concerns in the way that UK, Australia, the United States might define national security. So some of my research has focused on particular companies. One company that I looked at in a report in 2019, which I highlighted in this chapter, in this volume, is a company called Global Tone Communications Technology. That company is one that I think actually until my report on it came out, maybe there was nothing in Western media on this company. It's not very well known. but it's a company that's controlled by the Central Propaganda Department, and its business is machine translation. And it collects, or it offers translation services in I think it's 67 different languages. Now the company embeds its products in the supply chains of other much well-known companies globally. So AliCloud, for instance, according to its own admissions, the company's own statements about its activities, or Huawei. And in the Huawei case in particular, one example would be a device that's embedded in Huawei smart conferencing solutions, which is offered as part of smart cities packages that are exported globally. That device that aids translation or automated translation in conferences collects data that would enhance, ultimately for the company that's providing it, GTCom, would enhance the quality of translations. But because the company GTCom is controlled by the Central Propaganda Department, the data also goes back to them. Now, the direct use of that, and the problem with the sort of Huawei and espionage framing, is that that's not data that would be used to, say, listen into a specific conversation at a boardroom meeting or something like that. It could be, in theory, but that's not the most sort of interesting use case in my view. It's actually that the more accurate and the more refined that machine translation can become, the better the company's capabilities would be in terms of the generation of automated text. Now, there's a lot of research that I looked at in the context of that particular report that looked at using that business model to generate fake news comments underneath news articles. So you see that the kinds of data that we're looking at are the kinds of security risks that we're talking about when we think about the expansion of digital infrastructure globally aren't just the direct things that you can see, they're also the things that you can't see. Now, in terms of what do you do about it or how do you respond, well, that's where it becomes quite difficult. If you look at the way that, and I think it's very important to look at what China says about its intent and how it describes and sees particular concepts. So if you look at the Chinese party state's concept of state security, or even you look at data security within that, there's a very particular definition of what these things are and aren't. State security itself is a lot broader than the way that we might define national security here in the UK or the US or elsewhere. And that has implications in terms of, say, how you define what data sets might be of strategic value. And how do you go about protecting them, or what toolkits you have to perhaps deal with protecting them. So I guess I realize that I'm probably running past my 6-8 minutes here, but all I'll say is that I think we need to be thinking more broadly about what the issues are, and then our responses have to be sort of calibrated to the framework in which they're presented to us. Right now they aren't. Oftentimes we tend to be very narrow in focus, and as a result we're often missing the full scale of what we're dealing with, and our responses aren't necessarily adequate enough. I did want to say one last thing in terms of context and implications about data. So I gave you the propaganda example, but let's go to, say, COVID-19 and the way that the National Defense Mobilization System was activated in response to the COVID-19 crisis. One type of data might be economic data. Economic data in response for a national defense mobilization system enactment might help with the sort of quick, rapid response to a crisis. The same with health data or information data. Information data, in terms of the information operations that would have taken place to try to shape public perception of China's response to the crisis. All those kinds of things, there are other tools other than technology for engaging in that kind of propaganda or mobilization, but data certainly contributes to all of that. So there's a number of ways where you can look at data collected and it's used in a very particular way to serve economic interest, to serve companies' particular individual interests, but there's also a number of ways that same data can contribute to other things that are of direct security relevance to the party state or undermining the interests of the country through which that data emerged.
Right, thank you, Sam. Tim, let's go to you.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you also for the invitation to respond to this. I appreciate I'm flanked by authors of the report. So I better keep my comments clean. But I actually think it's a really good report. I think it's extensive, insightful, Obviously, it's very concerning, and what it does is it synthesizes a lot of strands that have been floating around for quite a while that I haven't seen put together in such coherent fashion, and I think it serves a very useful purpose. So I was asked to talk about cybersecurity, and I would, rather than, it's called a tactical concern in the introduction to the report. I think cybersecurity is actually a lot more strategic than that. It covers questions of espionage, intelligence, commerce, surveillance, subversion, warfare, and so on, all of which are facilitated or enabled by computer networks in ways not directed by its designers and users. But as Greg's chapter makes clear, it's precisely those kind of effects that operational and strategic activity, that's precisely what China is hoping to create or leverage through the types of activities that in this report are described as kind of, capturing global ICT architectures and so on. And by that we mean hardware, software, data, protocols, norms, standards that govern or guide the use of global ICTs. And in that vision, if you like, as long as they can be turned to China's advantage, then all to the good. And as we heard in the last panel, fairly obviously what's going on here is competing visions of what the global information environment is actually for and who should benefit. And, use that we again, we are quite comfortable pursuing our national interest within an open and interoperable ICT grid, but we're less sanguine about Chinese national interests being the de facto architect and beneficiary of that system. And that's really, from my perspective, that's where the tension is. And this political contestation is well articulated in the report, and as are the top-level geostrategic and security implications. So I just thought, just for my brief comments, I'd just respond to one part of the report, or it extends it really. One of the sections in the report is titled How the Party State Creates Risk, by which it means how does it create risk for other people. I thought it might be interesting to comment in the context of cybersecurity how China's state-led approach to digitization actually creates risk for itself or compounds risk, cybersecurity risk. Because the first concerns its approach to information security generally, it's a very expansive rubric, as you just mentioned, that incorporates both what we could call technical cybersecurity, but also content security, both of which are subservient to the types of state security that Samantha mentioned. And the argument here is that the party's been so preoccupied for so long with content security that it's rather neglected the fundamentals of its own technical information security. And a series of reports by the International Institute for Strategic Studies makes the case that although since 2015 the party has tried to rectify some of those information security shortcomings to remedy this situation, this is still very much a work in progress. And exactly as Samantha said, this is not about the top-level stuff about cyber warfare and cyber espionage. This is everyday mundane technologies, precisely the ones that are getting baked into smart cities and other, and everyone's pockets and houses too, and workplaces. But as a result, China's lagging somewhat in what we might call indigenous cybersecurity and in cyber defense and cyber resilience compared to its strategic competitors, of course, the US preeminently. And its own leadership has called this cybersecurity position as weak to very weak. And this is compounded by two factors, of course. The first is a dependency on foreign technology, which China was attempting to rectify, as outlined in the report. And the second is a legacy problem with intellectual and practical capacity. And as the IISS has pointed out, there are really very few world-class research institutions in cybersecurity in China, which may surprise us. It's got a surprisingly lethargic domestic cybersecurity industry. And the argument that's also made is that if patents in cybersecurity, and we often use patents as a proxy for innovation, a lot of the patents, and clearly China leads the way in terms of volume, a lot of those patents are rather more incremental than they are innovative, which can create perhaps a slightly false picture of Chinese cybersecurity. And educational reforms in cybersecurity are also somewhat sluggish. And we can make the argument that these factors are actually quite a problem for China. Firstly, because its competitors are aware of this and then can exploit this through various means, including intelligence gathering, targeted leaking, as we have seen, of elements of Chinese elites. And of course, in military crises, those networks can be exploited for cyber operations that diminish or render impotent Chinese military capability. And just expanding one's global digital footprint, which is what the report is talking about, does not guarantee digital security. In fact, far from it. If you extend yourself in this way, as the Chinese state seems to be, you may just be increasing what we call the attack surface of potential vulnerabilities that can be exploited by your competitors and your adversaries. And Washington, for example, knows it can exploit those weaknesses, as does Beijing. They're very conscious of the fact, actually, that they have some real cybersecurity vulnerabilities in their own networks. And how does that affect strategic and military strategic considerations, which is an open question. And worse than that, and I'll close here, is that if Chinese policy is to supply the world with Chinese digital technologies, that's a relatively unstable and unsecured attack surface that's being extended to its trade partners, including those countries with very little indigenous cybersecurity capacity of their own, by which I mean the global south. And one of the reasons why the UK sought to kind of prize Huawei out of the core telecoms networks in the UK is because Huawei chose not to fix vulnerabilities in its technology that it had been told about year on year on year on year. Just didn't think it was worth it. And when you look at Chinese technology, that kind of security by design is seriously lagging the rest of the world. And if you want to have safe or secure smart cities, China's going to have to do an awful lot better. Now, I think it probably will, but at the moment, China's technical cybersecurity problems are as much part of its export package as the technologies themselves. So, their problems become everyone else's too, which I think you can argue is not an ideal situation. So none of that provides any cause for rejoicing, but I hope it adds further texture to the conversation. Thank you.
Definitely another angle, Tim. Thank you very much. Let's go to Greg for the last set of comments here, and then we'll move on to some discussion.
Sure. Well, it's great to be with you all on a blue sky day here in London. So my job was to really look at the security framework for how to create a model to think about what China is doing. I will start by saying I'm the optimist of the crew here, first and foremost. And I hope, though, that as we kind of walk through some of these security realities, that we can all collectively kind of start to think through ways we can come together to address them. The first thing that we hit on in the security implications chapter was really the realization that there's a new domain of competition. We'll reach back in time to post-World War I, H.J. Mackinder, and his commentary around a seaman's view, a landman's view of competition and military engagement. We're now in a new world where the digital domain is a domain of competition. And we're witnessing it even today in an actual land war, right, where you have US companies now engaged in a variety of means, including SpaceX is providing services for free. These were the kinds of activities that were traditionally siloed within government capability. So the first kind of outcome of China's digital ambitions and what we're seeing kind of globally is companies are on the front lines, both good and bad. This is where there is advanced R&D taking place. Next generation and frontier technologies are being developed. It is where the strategic industries of today and tomorrow exist. When you think about economic power and its ability to translate into military might, that is a core feature of any global power today. So that is one of the kind of core realities that's coming out of our engagement with China. In my chapter, I talk about two companies in particular, China Eastcom on one hand and the Silk Road Information Port Co. on the other. These are companies that were set up by the Chinese government specifically to develop data collection and processing capabilities targeted within certain geographic domains. So China Eastcom, they are wholly focused on ASEAN countries, collecting data that then gets fed into the One Belt, One Road review process, so they can actually tactically see how it's being developed and managed. Like I said, this is a company, but it, for all intents and purposes, does not seem to be engaging in meaningful commercial activity, let alone operating in the modes that we in the West would expect a company to operate in. This is actually played out across the board when you're looking at the digital domain, and I think it's something that Samantha referenced as well. Another example of this is a company called Guangzhou Group, Shenzhen-based, Hong Kong Stock Exchange traded, doesn't seem to be making a whole lot of money somehow, but is, financing $300 million acquisitions of Singaporean fiber optic networks, right? So in my world, there is this kind of view that if a commercial deal doesn't seem to be financially viable, well, then it must be strategic. And so, we kind of have to step back a little bit sometimes and look at these activities and say, what is the strategic nature of it? What is the intent? And then how does that create a new baseline in the security paradigm within the commercial domain? All of this then kind of moves into this notion that industry has become a battle space. So what I mean by that isn't just companies competing with each other, but actually governments are increasingly engaged in the commercial domain. China is in particularly engaged in that domain as well, and it creates a blurring effect for companies here in the UK, for government agencies in the US, and this is actually where, this is my own personal view, this is where we reach those friction points in what to do. How do we actually compete in this new reality when we have such firm black and white views of commercial activity and government and public sector activity? And we actually have legal codes that separate the two, right? So how can government in the West compete in that same way? It becomes a very tricky challenge, right? Especially when you think about how companies operate given market norms, incentive structures, et cetera, right? So this is particularly evident in countries around the Indian Ocean, where China's One Belt, One Road initiative has really addressed meaningful issues and developmental challenges that they have, and why, when we travel through that region and talk to governments there, they'd love to have UK or German or American companies building fiber optic networks, telecommunication systems, ports. We're not there. So how can you compete in that way if the financial incentives that would drive a Western company that demand signal isn't coming through, right? The other irony of all of this is kind of flip it around. When you look at what China is doing across strategic emerging industries, it is intentional in many respects, and it's actually pretty well mapped out. So what I mean by that is, just give you an example, is the semiconductor industry. Strategic industry, as we all know. It took me 3 months to get a Jeep in America recently because we didn't have chips, which is just unbelievable as an American, right? You can't get a Jeep when you want it. So this is a core area where we're seeing China literally map out the global supply chain and value chain and R&D chain of the semiconductor industry and strategically place itself, either through licit or illicit means. Okay, so M&A acquisitions, totally okay, right? Goes through different CFIUS or government investment screening reviews. But then there's also illicit means, which is why the Taiwanese government just passed a new law, raided about 13 different local semiconductor companies and arrested dozens of people. Right, so there is an intention behind these activities. And then that kind of leads into the final point, which is underpinning this digital ambition is an entire global system to identify, target, and acquire foreign IP and know-how. And like I said, it's both through licit and illicit means. It's through talent programs. It's through the identification of startup companies in the US that might be doing work with the DoD and actually going in and providing investment dollars to them. But it is systematic in the way that they have analyzed their own internal system, identified capability gaps or vulnerabilities, and they're now actively trying to fill those, right? All with an intention of digital and technological sovereignty. So, I think all of these elements kind of fuse together, create a really interesting dynamic. And back to the Mackinder example, again, back 1914, his analogy was that Eastern Europe was this kind of heartland, right, in the great island, he called it. So who controlled the heartland controlled the great island, who controlled the great island controlled the world, right? I use this framing of the digital triad in my chapter, which is the combination of information communications technology infrastructure, data, and AI combined as a kind of new digital triad. Look, this is to be seen, but one could argue that in this new era, who controls that digital triad arguably controls the the next industrial revolution, right? And so this is really, when we talk about competition, what we're fighting for, that's where it exists, right? I think sometimes we can get overwhelmed with the expansiveness of China's activities and where we should target our competition. But really, it comes down to what is the future? What is that trajectory looking like? And where can we place ourselves in that competition to win? So thank you for your time.
Thanks, Greg. I'm going to actually have you or Sam respond to Tim's comment, because what I'm taking away, Tim, if I'm understanding your argument correctly, there's a certain lack of sort of higher end capability in some of the cybersecurity defenses that China is building. That leaves it vulnerable. I think if I'm understanding our report authors correctly, they might argue that there's a quality of scale where if China's sort of so dominant across so many marketplaces, that relative lack of sort of capability compared to maybe a Western system is less relevant because there's just a dominance in the market. But I'm curious if first of all, correct me if I'm wrong on that, but then Greg or Sam, how would you respond to Tim's kind of argument there that you know, China's becoming dominant, but maybe China's dominance is not as strong as we think it might be?
I'm happy to start. Yep. So on the lack of cybersecurity of many Chinese companies, sorry, I'm talking to the mic, that's a problem. It shouldn't be that people like me can access exposed smart cities databases, for instance, of Chinese companies freely online. You've seen that happen. You've seen that with some reporting last year focused on the Shanghai Public Security Bureau video information image database system. And that's a real problem, and that's part of the purpose of something like the data security law, which, you know, firstly, and the personal information protection law. Data security law establishes the parties' clear control over the data security system and the evolving data security system by putting the Central State Security Commission at its core. The personal information protection law makes it clear that companies and individuals are responsible for guaranteeing data security, and all that's aimed at ultimately protecting, I think, the parties' interests in accessing and using this data to its advantages and making sure that state competitors or, you know, researchers can't access that information. So that's one answer. In terms of patents, I did a project last year and focused on a little bit on critical technology and trying to benchmark where, specifically in this project, where the Quad was against sort of China, not against, but where they were in terms of the development of particular critical technologies, and trying to understand specifically how that development met the strategic objectives of those countries. One of the things that we focused on, and I'm no patent expert, but I relied specifically in that project with hours and hours and hours and hours of interviews with IP Australia, who helped to explain what we were looking at with the data. But one key observation was that, okay, China has the most patent applications in most of the technologies that we were looking at. But compared to the Quad countries in this case, the quality of those patents wasn't necessarily as high in terms of advancing the field, not in terms of maybe what the strategic objective would be for each of those countries. So Australia, for instance, had a very few number of patents, but actually was able to have a bigger impact on the field, which we were looking at, but didn't necessarily translate that into effective sort of market activity. So I would say that what's different with China, and particularly with patents, is actually that technology is being designed to meet a very specific strategic need oftentimes. And so the innovation ecosystem is different. It's not necessarily worse, but it's different. So we talk a lot in this paper about standards, and Emily's chapter in particular focuses on standard setting processes. Mine focused on one aspect of that, which would be the technical committees in China, which are focused on the development of standards for particular systems, like a facial recognition system, or the database schema behind a smart cities platform. And what you see is that like private companies, or companies, Huawei, Hikvision, Dahua, others, are involved in the standard setting process along with researchers from institutes such as research institutes that are associated with the Ministry of Public Security, Ministry of State Security, PLA. And they set the technical standards for particular technologies, which local companies are expected to meet in order to win bids for those types of projects. Obviously, the standards sometimes are evolving. So what standard was met when, say, a particular bid was won might be slightly different, but you see a process by which these technologies are being standardized at a domestic level. And those same ones are the ones that are going global. So they're, through market activity, those standards are being set globally. So I think in some ways, taking into account the accuracy of everything that you pointed out, I would say that also the way that China is advancing is also by creating buy-in and then worrying about solving those problems later. And that's part of what's a little bit different here.
Okay, thanks. Let's go to Greg next.
So you'll have to help me, were you talking about offensive capability or just capability in general? Because look, I mean, I would say their capability is sufficient. Okay.
Defensive, I was talking about.
Defensive? Okay.
Yeah.
Look, I think it's an evolving situation where you could also argue that there are gaps in capabilities in the U.S. cybersecurity system. I mean, which company in the U.S. hasn't been hacked? Which government agency hasn't been hacked? We live in a world where with enough willpower, intent, and time, you can probably figure out a cyber vulnerability. And I think that's been proven out time and time again. There are companies that literally spend millions of dollars a year protecting their cyber networks that somebody clicks on a phishing email and it's all for naught. So that's just the reality of the world that we're in. What I look at also is really like the use of the capability and the intention behind it. So we're talking a lot about data. In the US, when you see companies being hacked by nation states like China, it's not to necessarily disrupt their operation. It's to collect data. And that is the overarching concern that we should all have, is is that being reported? Which actually the SEC in the US just announced today that they were going to start to require disclosures of cyber intrusions. Why didn't that happen 10 years ago? I don't know. But I think there's awakening happening where folks are realizing that digital domain, that interaction between industry and government is the core battle space, and it's being targeted by governments across the world.
Tim,
Yeah.
I owe you a chance to have a response here.
No, I don't,
for it.
please don't misinterpret me. I'm not suggesting that there aren't chronic problems of cyber insecurity elsewhere in the world. There certainly are. Right? Merely trying to suggest that if this report is about Chinese rolling out massive infrastructural technologies in a way that is not available in terms of scale or scope to the West. Partly that's in China because they're locked out of those markets, but partly it's about Belt and Road, Digital Silk Road, Global South, all the sorts of partners that everyone's spoken about today. What sort of insecurities do you want in there? Do you want deliberate ones that are left there deliberately to enable surveillance? And that's going to be rolled out across the board to dozens and dozens of different countries, including potentially your own. Or do you want ones that can be fixed by open source investigations in the West and potentially fixed because you've got lots of eyes on that particular problem? And that's about software engineering. That's about network security. That's about having standards in the West. And I totally agree with you about the way the state is involved in standards and protocol setting. But which do we want? I mean, that's the only point I'm making, is that we talk a lot about China we often forget that China has cyber insecurity problems of its own. Right? Partly because of its own making, partly because, as you said, it's a systemic, generic thing in cybersecurity, and partly because their intellectual capacity in terms of institutions is not as strong as sometimes we think it is. Okay? It's brilliant at rolling out large-scale technological infrastructure. And you yourself said, quoting reports about patents, for example, that is a proxy for something, right? And all the stuff that's happened since 2015 is going in the right direction, as you were. There's a couple of observations about that. Because the first is you can scale technology, but you also scale insecurity. And actually, when you make a complex system like the internet, you keep scaling it up, the insecurity problems get worse because you have emergent behaviors in complex systems. So that's just one thing. The second is, it's all very well to say we'll fix the problems later, but we did that with the internet. We built it in the 1960s for simplicity, not security, and we have spent now, how many years? 55 years trying to re-engineer security back into the networks. And it's proving to be quite a difficult job. Otherwise, I would be out of a job, right? But those are the kind of things we have to remember. And the other thing is you can't just do security once. It's a process. So China might be able to say, okay, well, we know there's some issues, and they're not wrong, right? And to try to fix it later, and then you can't just fix it at once. You have to keep fixing it because it's a process. Security is a process. It's not just a kind of snapshot in time. And we've learned that, and the Chinese know this perfectly well. So it's something you have to keep on doing, and that's a really immense challenge. If you want to retain control, you know, we can pump products out to market, and essentially it's up to a relationship between the vendor and the client to resolve security issues. That's not what's being suggested of China. There's a relationship between the state and the sort of quasi-private vendors, and then the client states and various companies within those. That's an incredibly complex infrastructure to retain control over and to keep updating and keeping things secure and so on. So, I don't know. It's a little bit of a kind of crystal ball gazing, but there's definitely something in there that when we talk about Chinese capacity, we should remember its lack of capacity in other places too. But that's not a recipe for complacency, by the way.
Absolutely. I know we're running out on time, but I do want to bring the audience in here, so I think we've got time for a couple questions, and then I'll have our panelists respond to those. And I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair to ask one last question after they've addressed any from the floor. So if you have a question, can you raise your hand? I'm seeing none. Okay, well then I will ask my last one. Sam, you mentioned this need to think more broadly, and what I'm struck by is we're having conversations here in a public setting. We've been having conversations with people in government here in London. We do this a lot in Washington, D.C. Greg does as well with his business. Tim, I'm sure you have interactions with the government here. If I think about we, the West, however we define that in our responses, it seems to me that there are parts of government, there are parts of legislatures and parliaments, which in respect are essentially channeling public opinion, and there's the commercial sector. In the absence of a forcing function, a crisis like Ukraine that would affect China's digital ambitions and how we would respond to it, what are the things that could be done within democratic societies in terms of policy responses that would begin to move the conversation among the commercial, private sector, among elected representatives, and among governments, and especially the national security elements of governments, that would help to quote Greg, reduce the friction points and figure out what should we do. Greg, sorry, I'm going to put you on the spot first and have you go first. Sam, you second, and then Tim, you get the last word.
Well, actually, Tim and I were talking about this, and this is actually, I think, the real opportunity. Okay, so there is an opportunity for a leader in the West to actually articulate a vision for how to address not only China-related issues and the competition that's underway there, but also Russia and other authoritarian revisionist regimes. Personally, I don't see any profiles and courage emerging at the moment. I'm optimistic, like I said, but I think one of the core things that's lacking, and as an American, I'll just talk about America for a moment, is a shared vision of where we want to go as a society, and how that fits into a global view. A lot of this, you guys know, is very divisive domestically, but that is the opportunity, and I think the moment that is approaching us is a leader that can actually articulate path forward that incorporates those elements that you talked about, the government's role in this, industry, the legislature. When I talk to folks in the US Senate or on the Hill, There is bipartisan support for dealing with China as a threat. What to do? Very little bipartisan support, right? We like to shove money at problems in general, so there's plenty of consensus around that. But where that money goes and where it's targeted and is it meaningful or measured? Not really. So that, that's, I think, one of the real opportunities of the moment. I will just say too, and I'll wrap this up, industry is already taking the leading position on solving this. So in the US, right, the US Trade Representative's Office pegs the theft of Chinese IP theft on the US economy at 400 to 600 billion per year. What is the government doing about that? It's doing its best, I'll say that, but it's not enough. Companies in the US are just taking this matter into their own hands. They're developing ways to identify these threat actors and counter them organically on their own without the government, partly, as I mentioned before, because it's very limited for the intelligence community to share info with companies, right? So it's why companies like mine and Strider exist today, to bridge that gap. But that's a development that I think needs to start to spread across our systems in order to meaningfully counter these problems.
So I'll approach a question from maybe a more abstract perspective, where I'm thinking about a lot of the questions we've had in the last week in our meetings, and one of the questions that we were asked, or a couple of them, have been around, we in government understand the kinds of data security risks that you're talking about. We understand how data, when aggregated, can be incredibly valuable to a strategic competitor, but how do we get society to understand that, to understand that your personal data does have significance? And I think part of the problem that we have is that we haven't figured out how to have a good conversation around values, because as Greg was pointing out with the US, I mean, I've observed that just from living, I'm from the US, I lived here for a decade, I live in Australia now, I lived in Germany for a while, Taiwan, and I noticed that these conversations around values and technology are all going to be different no matter where you are, including within liberal democracies. And so if we don't have those conversations, then coming up with solutions is also going to be hard. And then the other thing that we need to think about, and perhaps to slow down the pace a little bit, how we're applying technology to solve problems, is what problems is technology actually solving in our societies? It solves many, and it has a lot of applications, and I'm not anti-technology, but oftentimes we tend to use or see technology as a solution to a lot of things that can be solved by other means. And perhaps, in developing a more coherent and well thought out response that, particularly for liberal democracies, represents our values, part of what we need to be talking about is what problems we're trying to solve and how technology is going to assist that process.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, Tim.
Yeah, I thought I'd fully endorse that. As with most problems of technology, the solutions are not technological. And I think it speaks to what you've just said. R&D, innovation, superpower this, digital that. It's like it's not always the right answer, particularly if you're wiring things up in an insecure way, and whether deliberately insecure in the part of deliberate technologies that can be used for surveillance purposes, for example, or for data extraction and intelligence gathering, whether just accidentally, because that's how engineering works, right? So the problems of this technology are just they're political, right? It's about allocation of resources, it's about will, about resolve, intent, and it's the big question of the early 21st century. It's, what vision of the world do we want? And we have to have that kind of, perhaps that leadership. Does it have to come from the West? I'm not sure. It doesn't have to. There's no sort of a priori reason why it has to be a Western European or North American leader that's going to articulate a vision of the future. It might be best if it wasn't, under some circumstances, particularly given the way swing states work in global governance and so on. It'd be very useful if it was someone not from the usual suspects or the like-minded. But who knows? There has to be an answer from somewhere. But somebody wrote a book about pessimism. I don't hold out much hope immediately, but keeping the communications open is absolutely essential in all of this. And there are some new initiatives going on in the UK with China that hopefully will bear some fruit. But yeah, it's a hell of a doozy in terms of problems. It's a wicked problem.
I wish you'd stayed on the positive side. We had such a pessimistic conclusion to panel 1 that it would have been nice to finish with vision and values on panel 2. But let me have Hannah come back. She'll tell us what's going to happen with the rest of the show. But please join me in thanking our speakers.
Thank you so much, Michael, Sam, Tim and Greg for that fascinating discussion, and thank you to the previous panellists for their thoughts as well. We've just got a very short break in proceedings before the next component, so you've got 10 minutes to go to the bathroom if you need or grab a glass of water up the back, but be back in your seats for 5:30 for our keynote address. Thank you.